when 68-year-old Martha Higgins started burying a bizarre round-doored cabin in her backyard, the entire town of Crestwood called her crazy. They laughed, they pointed, and they posted cruel videos online. But when the deadliest blizzard of the century hit, those laughs turned into desperate, freezing pleas for survival. Crestwood, Colorado, was the kind of idyllic mountain town where everyone knew everyone else's business. And conformity was the unspoken law. Houses were uniformly painted in muted earth tones, lawns were manicured to the exact millimeter, and eccentricities were politely but firmly whispered into submission. For 40 years, Martha Higgins fit perfectly into this mold. She was a retired school teacher, known for her award-winning petunias and her legendary peach cobbler at the annual Methodist bake sale. Her husband, Willow Higgins, was a quiet, brilliant structural engineer who spent his evenings tinkering in his garage. They were a perfectly normal, perfectly boring couple. Then, Willow died suddenly of a massive heart attack in the dead of winter. The town expected Martha to follow the standard protocol for a Crestwood widow, a period of mourning, perhaps downsizing to a sensible condo near the pharmacy, and fading into the quiet background of Sunday church services. Instead, 3 months after Willow's funeral, a convoy of heavy-duty earth movers roared down Elm Street and tore straight into Martha's pristine half-acre backyard. The digging begins. The neighborhood watch, led by the perpetually nosy Brenda Carmichael, was immediately on high alert. Brenda, whose house sat directly adjacent to Martha's, stationed herself at her kitchen window with a pair of Bushnell binoculars. At first, the rumor was a swimming pool, but as the excavators dug deeper, hitting a depth of 15 feet, that theory was discarded. Then, flatbed trucks arrived carrying massive prefabricated semicircles of steel reinforced concrete. "She's lost her mind with grief," Brenda told the cashier at the local grocery store, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "She's building a tomb. I swear, the poor woman is trying to bury herself alive to be with Willow." A crane lowered the concrete shells into the massive crater. Once assembled, the structure looked undeniably like a dwelling out of a fantasy novel, specifically a hobbit hole. It had a sweeping, curved roofline, circular cutouts for windows, and a perfectly round heavy oak door, painted a vibrant, defiant emerald green. But Martha didn't stop there. Once the structure was secure, she ordered the bulldozers to bury it. Tons of topsoil were pushed over the concrete shell until nothing remained but a grassy mound in the center of the yard, with only the round green door and a few reinforced porthole windows peeking out from the earth. Show. At Sally's Diner, the local morning hangout, the Hobbit cabin became the running punchline. "Hey, did you hear? Martha's looking for a wizard to share her lease," joked Tom Miller, the town's auto mechanic. to roaring laughter over black coffee and eggs. Teenagers started riding their bikes past her house, throwing pebbles at the round green door and yelling out quotes from fantasy movies. A drone even buzzed over her property, capturing aerial footage that Brenda Carmichael promptly uploaded to the Crestwood Community Watch Facebook page with the caption, "Property values plummeting. Does the city council care about Elm Street's new theme park?" Through it all, Martha remained entirely stoic. She didn't yell at the teenagers. She didn't respond to the Facebook comments. She simply wore her thick, woolen cardigan, standing on her back porch with a clipboard, checking off delivery manifests with a steely, unbothered determination. She knew something they didn't. She knew what Willow had spent his final years researching, and she knew the clock was ticking. As autumn rolled into Crestwood, the mockery began to shift into genuine frustration from the local authorities. The cabin was finished, heavily insulated beneath 3 feet of packed earth and seeded with fast-growing ryegrass. But it wasn't just a quaint underground novelty. Brenda's binoculars had caught sight of the deliveries that happened under the cover of dusk, and she had meticulously cataloged them for the neighborhood. The strange deliveries? I'm telling you, it's a cult compound. Brenda frantically whispered to Mayor Richard Lawson at the annual Autumn Festival. Yesterday, a truck from an industrial HVAC company dropped off a filtration system the size of a minivan. And last week, 3 pallets of military-grade lithium batteries and enough canned goods to feed an army. She's gone doomsday on us, Richard. Mayor Lawson, tired of the incessant phone calls complaining about the Elm Street eyesore, decided it was time to put an end to the madness. He dispatched Greg Hammond, the city's notoriously strict building inspector, to shut Martha down for code violations. It was a Tuesday morning when Greg marched up Martha's driveway, citation pad in hand, flanked by Brenda, who hovered near the property line pretending to rake leaves. Greg knocked aggressively on the front door of Martha's main house. Martha answered, sipping a cup of chamomile tea, her demeanor as calm as a windless lake. "Morning, Martha," Greg said, trying to sound authoritative but compassionate. "I need to see the permits for that structure in the back. You can't just build an underground bunker in a residential zone without city approval. I'm afraid I have to issue a stop-use order, and we'll need to talk about excavation to remove it." Martha didn't blink. "Wait right here, Greg." She retreated into the house and returned a moment later, not with a standard city permit, but with a thick leather-bound binder stamped with the insignia of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and the Department of Energy. The twist of the blueprints. Greg flipped open the binder, his brow furrowing as he read. The blueprints weren't drawn up by some local contractor. They bore the official seal of Willow Higgins, but with a title Greg had never seen, Lead Consultant, Extreme Climate Resilience Initiative. "What is this?" Greg asked, his voice losing its harsh edge. "My husband wasn't just building bridges, Greg," Martha said softly, her eyes hardening. The earth berm design, what you all call my hobbit hole, provides natural geothermal regulation. The structure can withstand 300-mile-per-hour winds, and the filtration system can handle complete atmospheric freezing. Greg stared at the federal overrides. By law, the structure was classified as an experimental federal prototype. The city of Crestwood had absolutely zero jurisdiction over it. Atmospheric freezing? Greg scoffed nervously, handing the binder back. Martha, we live in Colorado. We get snow, we don't get ice ages. You're wasting your retirement money. When Brenda heard the news that the cabin was untouchable, the ridicule reached a fever pitch. The town decided Martha was simply a paranoid old woman clinging to the delusions of her late husband. The mild winter and the sudden shift. December arrived, and it brought the mildest winter Crestwood had seen in 3 decades. By Christmas, there wasn't a flake of snow on the ground. People were wearing light jackets. The local hardware store couldn't even sell their stock of snow shovels and rock salt. Sure glad I didn't build a bunker, Mayor Lawson joked at the town's New Year's Eve party, drawing a hearty laugh from the crowd. Martha, sitting quietly in the corner, simply sipped her sparkling cider and watched the meteorological readouts on her phone. Then came January 14th. It started as an ordinary sunny Tuesday. But halfway across the country at the National Weather Service headquarters, alarms that hadn't been triggered in 50 years began to blare. Meteorologist Derling, a veteran forecaster, stared at the radar in absolute horror. A massive, unprecedented anomaly was forming. A collapse of the polar vortex had merged with a freak, Pacific moisture stream, creating a phenomenon scientists called a stratospheric shear. It wasn't just a blizzard. It was a weather bomb that would drop temperature so fast the air itself would feel like it was crystallizing. By 2000 p.m., emergency alerts shrieked on every cell phone in Crestwood. You are gent. Cataclysmic winter. Immediately. The seas defends Bonning A. But next door, Martha Higgins put down her tea. She walked out her back door, her boots crunching on the dry winter grass. She walked up to the grassy mound, unlocked the heavy emerald green door, and stepped inside. As she pulled the thick, hermetically sealed door shut behind her, the locking mechanism engaged with a heavy, definitive thud. An hour later, the sky over Crestwood turned the color of bruised iron, and the temperature began to plummet, not by degrees, but by tens of degrees. The great freeze had arrived. At 3:15 p.m., the sky over Crestwood didn't just darken, it seemed to solidify. A low, guttural howl echoed down from the mountain pass, a sound that made the stray dogs howl and the birds scramble frantically into the pine trees. Then the temperature fell off a cliff. Meteorologist David Sterling's nightmare scenario was unfolding with terrifying precision. The mercury plunged from a balmy 45 degrees to zero in less than 20 minutes. The atmospheric moisture, caught in a sudden superfreeze, didn't fall as snow. It fell as heavy, jagged ice pellets, driven by 70-mile-per-hour winds that stripped the remaining autumn leaves from the oak trees and shattered the stained glass window of the Methodist church. Inside her pristine living room, Brenda Carmichael felt a sudden violent draft. She cranked her thermostat up to 80 degrees, muttering about the drafty windows in these older Elm Street homes. At 3:42 p.m., the town's primary electrical substation on Miller Road, overloaded by thousands of residents simultaneously blasting their central heating, blew out in a spectacular arc of blue plasma. The power grid failed instantly. Crestwood plunged into darkness. The unraveling of Elm Street. Mayor Richard Lawson, trapped inside City Hall, tried to dispatch the snowplows, but the diesel in their tanks had gelled into useless sludge. The town was paralyzed. By 6:00 p.m., the temperature outside was negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind chill approaching negative 70. In her home, Brenda was wearing 3 winter coats, 2 pairs of wool socks, and a ski mask. Her breath plumed in the air of her own kitchen. She watched in horror as the water in her dog's bowl froze solid in front of her eyes. The house, built for standard Colorado winters, was hemorrhaging heat. Without the furnace, the ambient temperature inside was dropping by 10 degrees every hour. Across the street, Tom Miller, the mechanic who had loudly mocked Martha at the diner, was frantically trying to ignite his gas fireplace. But the exterior gas valves had frozen shut. His 2 young daughters were huddled under a pile of blankets, shivering violently, their lips taking on a terrifying shade of blue. "Dad, it hurts," his youngest cried, the cold seeping into her joints. Tom looked out his frosted window. Vahadis. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. If we stay in this house tonight, we are going to die. The desperate migration. The structural groans of her house were deafening as the wood and drywall contracted violently in the deep freeze. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from her basement. Her water mains had burst, instantly flooding the lower level with water that began to freeze into a skating rink. Desperation stripped away her pride. She stumbled to her frost-covered kitchen window and scraped away a circle of ice. Next door, Martha Higgins's yard was a chaotic sea of drifting snow. But there, barely visible through the swirling whiteout, was the gentle slope of the buried cabin. and emanating from the thick, reinforced porthole windows was a soft, steady amber glow. Power. Warmth. Life? Brenda didn't think. She grabbed a flashlight, wrapped a thick wool scarf around her face, and threw open her back door. The wind physically threw her backward, but she fought against it, plunging into snowdrifts that were already waist-high. She wasn't the only one. Figures began emerging from the freezing houses on Elm Street, bundled in a chaotic assortment of blankets and winter gear. Tom Miller was carrying his youngest daughter, dragging his eldest by the hand. Greg Hammond, the building inspector who had tried to shut the project down, was practically crawling through the snow, frostbite already turning his cheeks a sickly white. They were all converging on the very thing they had relentlessly mocked. They were marching toward the Hobbit cabin. The wind on Elm Street was no longer just moving air. It felt like solid sheets of microscopic glass tearing at exposed skin. The temperature had plummeted past -40, and the wind chill created a vortex of lethal, suffocating cold. She pounded on the heavy oak and steel surface with the frozen plastic casing of her flashlight. "Martha!" she screamed. The wind instantly snatched the word from her mouth, throwing it into the blinding white void. "Martha, please, we're freezing. I'm sorry. Please, open the door." Right behind her, Tom Miller collapsed against the curved earth-bermed wall of the entryway, trying to use his own body as a windbreak for his two young daughters. The girls were shivering so violently that their teeth clicked in a terrifying, erratic rhythm. Their lips were a dark, bruised purple. Next came Greg Hammond, the city building inspector, dragging his heavy boots through the waist-high snow, his face pale and coated in a sheen of frost. They gathered at the threshold of the woman they had relentlessly mocked, entirely at her mercy. The irony was as bitter as the cold. They expected silence. They fully anticipated the vindictive triumph of a widow wronged by her neighbors. They had laughed at her late husband's life's work. They had called her a crazy, paranoid nuisance. Brenda had publicly humiliated her online. Why on earth would Martha Higgins open that door? Inside, the heavy metallic clack of a deadbolt disengaging echoed like a gunshot. A complex pneumatic seal hissed, and the heavy emerald door swung inward. A wave of glorious 70-degree air washed over the freezing crowd, smelling faintly of damp earth and growing green things. Standing in the threshold was Martha, wearing her usual woolen cardigan, a clipboard in one hand and a heavy thermal blanket in the other. She didn't look triumphant. She looked utterly focused. "Get inside," Martha ordered, her voice cutting through the howl of the storm with teacher-like authority. Quickly. The thermal lock can only stay open for 40 seconds before we lose internal ambient pressure. Brenda, Tom, his children Greg, and a dozen other shivering neighbors piled into the entryway, weeping openly as they stumbled over the threshold. Martha hit a red button on the wall. The heavy door swung shut on its motorized hinges, sealing with a definitive airtight thud. Instantly, the deafening roar of the blizzard was completely extinguished, replaced by the low, comforting hum of an industrial ventilation system. The descent into Willow's legacy. As the townspeople collapsed onto the concrete floor of the antechamber, stripping off their frozen coats and gasping the warm air, they finally looked around. They were in a small, circular room made of reinforced steel. "Martha," Brenda sobbed, shivering uncontrollably as she looked up from the floor. "I am so sorry. I thought you were just building a crazy little bunker. I was so awful to you." "Thank you for saving us." Martha looked down at Brenda. There was no malice in her eyes, only a quiet, weary grief. "Brenda, this isn't a cabin. And Willow didn't build it for me. Stand up. We need to get everyone to the lower level before the secondary freeze hits." Martha turned a massive submarine-style wheel on a secondary steel door and pushed it open. The townspeople gasped, the sound echoing down a wide, brightly lit ramp that spiraled deep into the earth. Following Martha down, they expected a cramped, claustrophobic panic room. Instead, they emerged into a staggering 5,000-square-foot subterranean complex. It was a marvel of modern survival engineering, far exceeding anything the town had imagined. Greg Hammond's jaw dropped as his trained eyes scanned the room. The complex was divided into meticulously organized sectors. The life support grid. Along the far wall sat massive, silent banks of military-grade solid-state batteries, wired directly into a closed-loop geothermal heat exchange system. The hydroponic bay. An entire wing of the bunker glowed under soft ultraviolet lights, where rows of tomatoes, spinach, and root vegetables grew in nutrient-rich water channels. The living quarters, 50 sturdy cots, were arranged in neat rows, complete with thermal sleeping bags. The triage center, a fully stocked medical bay, sat near the industrial kitchen, complete with sterilized trauma kits and oxygen tanks. What is this place?" Tom Miller whispered, carrying his youngest daughter, who was finally beginning to regain the color in her cheeks. "Willow knew this was coming," Martha explained, standing at the center of the room. "When he was working as the lead consultant for the Extreme Climate Resilience Initiative, his climate models showed that a polar vortex collapse was inevitable within the decade. He also mapped Crestwood's power grid. It was 50 years out of date, structurally incapable of handling a sudden, catastrophic freeze." Greg Hammond closed his eyes, a wave of profound shame washing over him. "He brought a proposal to the city council 5 years ago," Greg said softly, remembering the meeting. "He wanted a multi-million-dollar grant to winterize the substation and bury the mains. And Mayor Lawson laughed him out of the room," Martha said flatly, stating a fact rather than an accusation. "They called him an alarmist. They said Crestwood didn't need to waste taxpayer money on a doomsday scenario." Martha walked over to a steel table and ran her hand over a set of laminated blueprints. "When the city refused, Willow cashed out his entire pension, our life savings, and took out a massive federal loan. He spent the last years of his life designing this. The earthworm shape on the surface. Hobbit hole you all laughed at was mathematically designed to deflect 300-mile-per-hour winds and prevent snow accumulation from crushing the roof. He'll spend your life savings to build a bunker for a town that mocked him. Willow didn't build a personal fallout shelter, Brenda, Martha said, her voice finally catching with emotion. He built a localized neighborhood lifeboat. This facility is rated to sustain 50 people off-grid for 3 months. He built it for you. All of you. Tears streamed down Tom Miller's face. The man who had loudly joked about Martha looking for wizards at the local diner was now entirely dependent on her husband's genius to keep his children alive. He gently set his daughters down on a cot, walked over to Martha, and lacking any words that could possibly suffice, simply hugged her. For the first time since Willow died, Martha hugged someone back. The sheer weight of the ice collapsed the roofs of older homes. Undrained water pipes detonated inside walls, instantly turning living rooms into frozen, shattered glaciers. Mayor Lawson and a few others who had managed to shelter in the basement of City Hall were burning office furniture just to stave off hypothermia. But 30 feet beneath Elm Street, 28 residents lived in absolute surreal comfort. The social dynamics of the neighborhood underwent a massive permanent shift. There was no more gossip. There was no more posturing about property values or perfectly manicured lawns. They were a crew, keeping a ship afloat. Tom Miller took charge of maintaining the geothermal pump mechanics, utilizing his skills as an auto mechanic to monitor the coolant lines. Brenda Carmichael, stripped of her nosy neighborhood watch persona, Greg Hammond spent hours studying Willow's blueprints, taking meticulous notes, vowing to rewrite the entire city building code if they ever saw the sun again. In the evenings, they sat together in the warm amber light. They listened to the terrifying muffled roar of the storm raging above them through the surface audio monitors, acutely aware that without Willow Higgins, they would all be frozen statues in their own homes. On the morning of the 5th day, the audio monitors fell silent. Martha checked the external atmospheric sensors. The temperature had risen to a manageable 20 degrees, and the wind had died down to a gentle breeze. It was time. Together, the neighborhood gathered at the base of the ramp. Martha led the way, spinning the heavy wheel of the airlock and pushing open the emerald green door. The light that poured in was blinding. As they stepped out onto the surface, they were met with a landscape that looked alien. Crestwood was buried under 6 feet of snow in solid ice. The houses on Elm Street were unrecognizable windows shattered by the pressure drop, siding ripped away, roofs sagging or completely caved in. It was a zone of total devastation. In the distance, the heavy rhythmic thumping of twin-rotor helicopters echoed off the mountains. The National Guard was arriving to begin what they assumed would be a massive body recovery operation. When the rescue teams finally bulldozed their way down Elm Street, expecting to find houses filled with casualties, they stopped in their tracks. Standing on a perfectly clear, geothermally melted patch of grass in the center of a ruined neighborhood were 28 healthy, warm, and deeply changed people. The story of the Hobbit cabin made international headlines within 24 hours. FEMA officials arrived to formally debrief Martha, taking Willow's blueprints to immediately begin replicating the neighborhood lifeboat design in other vulnerable high-altitude communities across the country. Crestwood took years to rebuild, but the town never looked at Martha Higgins the same way again. The mockery was permanently replaced by a profound deferential respect. When they reconstructed Elm Street, they didn't just rebuild their houses, they completely overhauled the grid, using Willow's notes as their Bible. And right in the center of the neighborhood, surrounded by newly planted genetically hardy petunias, the round emerald green door remained. It was no longer an eyesore. It was no longer a punchline. It stood as a permanent monument to a brilliant man's foresight, a widow's unwavering grace, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the very thing we laugh at is the only thing that can save us. What would you have done if you were Martha? Would you have opened the door for the neighbors who mocked you, or left them in the cold? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible real-life tales of survival, twists, and redemption. Stay warm out there.